We at Bond University would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on whose land we are gathered, the Kumamberi people, and we'd also like to pay respects to elders past and present and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within the Yugambeh language group.
Kapakut Nuzanel Jondayah Martin. I'm a Torres Strait Islander woman and I'm currently studying at Bond University. Welcome to our special NAIDOC Week podcast. In this three-part series, we will explore the themes of voice, treaty and truth through the stories of some of our most inspiring Indigenous community members.
I grew up as a kid without any identity, without any understanding, my understanding of Aboriginality or identity was prison. And so when I was introduced to culture by my grandparents when I was 16, and then when I went back to live in the bush at 18, it changed my life forever.
As the oldest surviving culture on Earth, Australia's Indigenous voice has been around for more than 65,000 years. Our languages have been passed down through generation, through sharing culture, stories, and traditions that are inseparable from our truth. Jeremy Donovan has used his voice to inspire and connect people all over the globe. In fact, he's made a career out of it. Some of you might even remember Jeremy as the Indigenous artist who played the didgeridoo at the Sydney 2000 Olympics. Since, he has travelled the world, sharing his talents and his story. And his story is a remarkable one. Jeremy joined me to share how culture helped him find his voice, discussing the importance of Indigenous voices in today's society, and how we can move forward as Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians together to create a better future. So thank you for joining us today, Jeremy.
It's good to see you.
And how are you?
Good. It's always good to be back.
Yeah, good to see you.
Yeah.
So can you tell us where you're from, the listeners?
So my traditional family, I always identify myself as a Gulka Yaranji man. Mm-hmm. But my traditional families are Gulka Yaranji, Gulgimata, Google Taipan, from that northern Queensland, the North Queensland and northwestern Queensland, so just in the southern part of the Cape.
Right.
So if you pretty much drew a line in Mossman Gorge and we took it up to Hope to Cooktown, and then west out past Laura, that's where the majority part of my family are. And then we've got family over in Yedakala over with Yolngu Mata people. So yeah.
But where did you grow up?
I was born in Cairns,
and
born at Mossman, and then I was raised down in Sydney pretty much. I went down there when I was almost 6 years old as a foster kid.
So the foster care system.
Yeah. So I was awarded the state, so I belong to Queensland, essentially.
So throughout your life, you've obviously faced many different adversities, and I think a lot of what has happened to you has helped bring you to where you are today. What have been some defining points that have shaped who you are today in regards?
I think you're exactly right. I think unfortunately sometimes adversities they define people, right? And sometimes the definition of someone, especially when it's been pretty tough, it's really hard to break out of that, that really, that painful start or the painful beginning. And I guess I've been lucky, as well as, worked really hard to ensure that, whatever it was that, was painful or that was tough at start has really been the foundation for who I become rather than who I am. And so I sort of let the pain, be the inspiration, and so pain was always, I've always looked at it as a very powerful foundation to stand on. And so when I look at my early life as a foster kid, I was, in 17 families before I was 5, so I could barely, when I got to Sydney, I could barely speak, because of the abuse and different things that I'd gone through that I don't remember, but obviously we know, looking at, sort of the life of a child that, a child should be able to do certain things by a certain age, and when they haven't, it's usually as a result of neglect or, some sort of disability. And, we know that it was unfortunately more a result of neglect. And so for me, it really, it meant that everything was always behind the eight ball, so going to school was tough, learning was tough. I have a hard time sitting still at the best of times, even still today, And so, school wasn't for me. School was really difficult. And, still, if I have to go sit in anywhere, in a classroom, if I go to an event, or if I'm doing public speaking and they ask me to sit in the front row, but those early things, from the troubles at school, then led into, sort of entering into the juvenile justice system at 13 years old, to then, sort of that system, that we all know, unfortunately too well, is that, the pathway to prison is easier to get to than the pathway to university.
Yeah.
And, I think that, that was, a tragic, sort of pathway that I took in a way, but at the same time, that pathway has led me to, sort of what I do today, everything that I am, because, I believe that, sometimes, I think one of the quotes that I wrote on the walls, of the prison when I was in there was, like sort of, how can I dream to be anything when all I see is this?
Yeah.
And it was basically talking about, the walls, like when all I could see are the walls, that the uniform defines who I am, like the clothes define who I'm going to become. There was nothing that ever had a narrative of change, and, this is what I think, is one of the hardest realities that we face when our people find themselves incarcerated, is that how do we change when you've defined actually who we are and who we can ever become, because we don't get freedom.
So for you, like, what was one of the most, like, I guess, what was the turn point in your life where you saw,
Culture.
I guess, culture?
Culture saved me.
Yeah.
I grew up as a kid without any identity, without any understanding, like, my understanding of Aboriginality or identity was prison.
Yeah.
And so when I was introduced to culture by my grandparents when I was 16, and then when I went back to live in the bush at 18, it changed my life forever.
Yeah, because I believe from hearing from your story in the past that you were a bit older when you actually found out that you were Aboriginal.
I was 13. I always thought that I was from a Polynesian background.
Yeah.
So when I was 13 and find out that you're Aboriginal, I was confused because I didn't know anything positive about Aboriginal people at that age. So all of a sudden, everything I knew were based around negative stereotypes or the derogatory, sort of playground stereotypes that unfortunately we used to hear far more then, but we still unfortunately hear today. And so that shaped my identity, and so, from 13 to 16, it was very much shaped by incarceration. And then it wasn't until, I guess, my grandfather notion, this point of like, if you don't have a dream, you don't have a destination, so you need to find your dream.
So would you say that your grandfather has been a role model?
The biggest influence in my life in terms of changing my life, because it really framed the pathway to what I could become, based around if you dream it, then you can create it.
And would you know with NAIDOC's theme and in regard to voice, would you say that your grandfather helped give you a voice?
It's still a voice that I listen to.
Yeah.
Still today, it's a voice that I can, I confide in, like it's the voice of my grandfather is still the voice that I sit down at the fire with, and, when I'm doing it tough, it's almost like, culture was my religion, is that, some people turn, to the advice of God or whatever it might be. But for me, it was turn to the advice of my grandfather because it was his voice of just stability and non-judgment. I think for me that will always allow me to, find strength to move on, and even through the harder times that I faced recently in life, because life is up and down. It's a roller coaster, right? And, it's the voice of my grandfather that I still will, sort of, turn to by the fire.
And what about you? So you've got some children. How do you try to tell them to use their voice?
Yeah, I guess I'm really blessed. I've got 4 beautiful kids, like it's like even leading up, to the conversation now, just talking to my children are my life. They're my inspiration. My children are the reason why I do everything. Yeah. Because I know for me is that I want to just be a footprint. That basically they can see how far I got and then they can go so much further. Yeah,
and I guess you've been able to use your culture and it has taken you places that I guess a lot of people couldn't even imagine.
Culture took me to the world, it saved my life. It's, in 2000 I came to Sydney as a didgeridoo player with Bangara. I then, a didgeridoo player who opened up, the Sydney Olympic Games. The night that Kathy Freeman won, that 400, I was playing didgeridoo in a private suite for the ambassador to Switzerland. After that they asked me if I'd go to Switzerland. I couldn't because I needed like a 7-year non-conviction period before I can leave the country. But Switzerland, they gave me a diplomatic passport. I went to Geneva to speak at the United Nations about, sort of my upbringing and the story. So culture gave me the keys to the world, and from that, I've played in Carnegie Hall. I've played in, the White House and Buckingham Palace. I've had, such an incredible life as a result of culture,
So reconciliation is something that in Australia we're still trying to achieve. What are your thoughts on
I don't think we understand what reconciliation is, really.
Well, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, the thing for me is like, what have we got to reconcile? Like, reconcile is actually, when I was going through a divorce, we needed, reconciliations, but that means that there was an agreement and the agreement got broken, and so now we have to reconcile our differences. One of the hard things I think we have in this country is there was never an agreement. And so therefore, what do we reconcile? We actually need to create a conciliation where we actually come together, where we actually, what is the future that we see as black and white Australians for each other? Because at the moment, we're trying to reconcile differences that we don't understand. One, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we're wounded. Our pain is still so fresh, and so our trauma often presents the moment we have to have a conversation about something. And so the moment we get asked a question, we answer with our trauma, and the trauma is usually pours out in such a way that it can be perceived as aggressive, or it can be perceived as, and it's often misunderstood because it's trauma. And so I think when I think about the notion of reconciliation, is that we actually have to understand each other. And right now, we've come a long way, right? But I think one of the biggest things is that we have to be brave enough as a nation to actually address and come to terms with the truth of this country, that we still dance around things, when we talk about Australia Day, it always brings up, like the media portrays it in a way that, separates us. You always see, I refuse, to participate in Australia Day activities for the way that the media shapes it, because you will always see it shaped as, the Union Jack, these lovely, white faces on the beach, with stickers on the side of their face, and then it's always, the angry marches of Aboriginal people protesting Australia Day. It's never the celebratory, notion of the way that we actually, we hurt with Australia Day, because the truth is, when you talk about Australia Day, the 26th of January, it's like, it was only 11 minutes before the first Aboriginal person was shot. That's true facts. It wasn't kumbaya, it wasn't, dance around. And I think the fact is that we have to be brave enough as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to acknowledge that it was painful, and I often use my own story as that, my life was, like the painful start became the foundation for success.
Yeah, and that's what I really love about like your story, is that you were able to take all these obstacles and find something special within it and use that to empower yourself.
Yeah, and I guess I've always, sort of taken, rather than sort of let the negative and the most negative aspect of a story define you, let the negative inspire me. Like it was, I think that comes from, it's, whether it's ingrained in you, like, if we were 30 points down on a football field, I still believe that the 30 points down meant that we only had to score 34 to win. And that's, that's the person that I am, and it's the person I think I'll always be, is that I don't want to be defined by the odds against me,
Yeah, and like moving forward with your like life experience, what's the advice that you give to your children as an Indigenous person in Australia today?
You have to work hard.
Yeah.
I tell and whether people like it or not, I say that my children, when you walk out our front door, you're already 2 steps behind. And I said, don't let those 2 steps behind define you. Let them be that you have to work that much harder, be that much more polite. You have to be that much, because that's the reality, is that to change the perception of people, unfortunately, that are often, like I said, my son was walking home with 2 friends. They knocked, his 2 friends who were non-Indigenous knocked over a letterbox, but my son, who didn't knock it over, but he was there, he got blamed. I was like, of course, like that's the 2 step behind average, is that you have to work that much harder to actually, to prove and to change the perceptions. For me, as a big person with tattoos, on an aeroplane, always going out of my way to make sure that I help people go over the top, because it shocks people almost into a point like, wow, I didn't expect that from him. And so for me, it's always been, for me with my kids, work that much harder, because you have so much to be proud about.
Yeah.
So don't let working hard be what defines you. Like you have so much to be proud about, so don't worry about how hard you have to work.
Yeah. So like one of the NAIDOC thing areas that we're focusing on today is voice. What does that mean for you in terms of voice and NAIDOC's thing?
I guess for me, I think of my grandfather. My grandfather's voice is the voice that echoes to me, when, through every memory, like we sit here, I close my eyes, I can still hear I hear my grandfather sing to me, I hear my grandfather talk to me, and I guess when I think about voice, I just hope that, like my voice can be a lighthouse, just to let people know that, I got to this distance, but the generation of you guys that I meet at this university, you have so much potential, and it's not that we are just lighthouses because you're going to go so much further than us, because we're just standing on the platform that was laid for us. And so therefore we create a platform that then is there for you to stand on, to elevate your voice and to continue your voice. And I think that the voice is how our culture has survived, and I think it is how our culture will continue to survive.
So in the past you've worked for Bangara, you've done the Olympics, so what are you currently doing?
I've probably had, my life or my career is, I don't have I've never had a resume. So I've never applied for a job in my life. Still to this day, I've never applied for a job. I don't have a single, certificate in anything, but, I went from Bangara to then, working as a solo didgeridoo player to then doing like cultural education for all the embassies around Australia, around the world. And then I went on to just public speaking, and then I had a position as the CEO of a non-for-profit with Generation One, which was a philanthropic group around Indigenous employment. And once I got to that point and the federal government funded our initiative, I stepped away from it because I always said that my role was to put myself out of a job. And then I went back to working for myself. And these days today, primarily the pieces of work, I'm fortunate enough to be as an ambassador with the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation. And that's a role that I take, is really important to me, because someone that can't read and write very well, it's critical. Our children need to be able to read and write. I have a really privileged position as, I guess, an ambassador with Bond University, which allows me to come into platforms like this and speak with you guys and work with the young students at the Yomba Centre. And it just really, those sort of are the pieces that really mean the world to me. And then I have a contract with the federal government advising them around how do we fix the prison system?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to touch on next. So obviously you've worked with Indigenous youth in the prison system. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's one of the greatest stains on our history at the moment, is that I think Australia was built for the narrative of building a prison. So 250 years ago, it was for a prison, and then we haven't changed that narrative. We just keep building new prisons. We're not addressing issues. So we're not looking at human reform or human behaviour. We basically, people are getting incarcerated and not having any rehabilitative programs again. So if you look, like here, I think we have right now with Aboriginal offenders, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander offenders, we have a 76% recidivism rate. So whereas if you look over in places like in Denmark or in those regions of Europe, they've got a 6% recidivism. And why? It's because they have mandatory sentences, they have rehabilitative programs.
Yeah, so do you think that there's a need to be more... Yeah.
One of our biggest problems is that most Aboriginal people are on short sentences. They're usually in there on remand. And when you're on remand, you get no access to no rehabilitative program. So if you serve 4 3-month sentences, or 3 4-month sentences, you get no program. You would have been better off just being given a year and get all these rehabilitative programs in terms of looking at all the social issues that come hand in hand with poverty, which because the majority of offences are just directly related to poverty. Everyone made me worse.
So how would you recommend as a community we can use our voice to empower those that need to be empowered?
I think, as a community, we have to be brave enough to address our own issues as well. One of the hardest things I think for anyone to do or any organisation to do is to admit their own faults and their own failings, and that's a vulnerable position to be in. When you stand up, admit your own failings or admit your own wrongs, and I think that's what we have to be brave enough to do as a community, to admit that a lot of the reason why our kids are in these positions is because of perpetuating problems within our communities. But the reality is we have strong leaders. And we have strong voices, and those strong voices have to be behind the rehabilitation of our kids. We we have to allow children, to be able to go back to country. We have to allow kids to, who have never had country, to go and experience country, like 3 months as a kid from the Gold Coast or the kid from Sydney, to go back and spend 3 months on the islands, fishing, hunting, all those things.
In your opinion, what role does education play in helping the younger Indigenous generation find their voice?
I think education is the most critical piece. It's the piece that I don't have any education, and I don't say that proudly, but I tell everyone, about it. I certainly, don't say it to kids as a way of saying, follow my footsteps. I don't have it. I talk about the fact that I know how much easier life would have been had I have not been such a ratbag and probably paid attention and probably been given a better start. Education is the most critical piece. Last night, like sitting at the table with my daughter, and she's up on my lap and she's reading me her book, and she's reading a book that is of grade 2 and I can't read it. For me is such a beautiful thing to see her empowered with education, because then I have the ability to empower with culture. And so, culture is not a cape. We can't take it off, but it will grow as much as you give it, and the same with education. The more you put into education, the more you can achieve with it. But you don't have to pick one or the other. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things the thing that people can't grasp out there is that since when do we have to pick one or the other? We actually can we are both, because culture is who we are and education is what we can attain.
Well, thank you for joining us today at Bond. It's been lovely to catch up with you again.
No, it's always good. It's always deadly, so to catch up.
So,
I'll catch you guys soon.
Eso.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me for this conversation with the inspiring Jeremy Donovan. You can find out more about Jeremy and listen to our other podcasts at bond.edu.au. I'm Jondayah Martin, and this podcast was brought to you by Bond University.